Good afternoon. I'm Scott McDonald, and I'm the president and CEO of the Advertising Research Foundation. And I'd like to welcome you to part two of our two-part Insight Studio series on privacy frameworks. And a special thanks to Meta for their sponsorship of both of these studios. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. Please submit any questions that you have at any time via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And a note that we will be recording today's event and writing up key takeaways, which you will be able to view and read early next week. Go to the next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about the genesis of these two privacy studios. They grew out of a series of conversations with Meta about the implications of this sort of vast amount of uncertainty of regulatory and platform changes regarding privacy, and the effect that that would have upon both marketing and measurement. And the core question we were asking ourselves at the outset, at least, was, can we at least agree on what the variables are, what the conceptual framework is for thinking about this evolving privacy landscape? Given that there were so many unknowns that challenge any kind of sensible business planning for these, we thought that it would be useful to try to organize a series of discussions for the purpose of clarifying industry thinking. And it led us to kind of the idea of reviving a technique that doesn't get used as often as it once was, but we think was very appropriate, the Delphi technique, where you gather some knowledgeable people, some people that are sort of domain experts in a subject, and give them a common stimulus, a common provocation, usually something written, a point of view, and ask them to comment on that, and then circulate all of the comments again for them to comment on what other people have said. And so that's what we've done in this case. And the ARF will be publishing the output from this Delphi report or Delphi document. But I thought I would share with you in the audience the three broad elements of the proposed framework that was sort of created at the start of this process and that used, and in particular because our panel of experts, for the most part, could actually agree on this. So we thought maybe we got it right. So the proposition started with the notion that decreased access and processing of individually identifiable data will result in increases in data aggregation, where that's still available, and in decreases in the ability to connect data across different touch points and platforms. It also will result in increases in the need to join data sets on different identifiers, which will include matching across online and offline identifiers. It will also result in an increased reliance on model data, including AI solutions, but also on some of the older modalities in marketing and analytics, including contextual advertising and market mix modeling. And finally, that this decreased access will increase the use of alternative strategies, such as privacy-enhancing technologies, like differential privacy, but there are others sort of on offer and in development, but also panels and additional analytic techniques, more weighting, more corrections to try to mitigate some of these challenges. So that's one piece of that framework. On the next slide, we put forth the proposition that limitations on where, how, and how much data can be used will lead to an increase in data minimization, so processing the least that is possible in each instance, a more purposeful data use, clearly defining where data can be used and ensuring that data is only used for that purpose, to not be violating the permission given by consumers, and an increase in the importance of mass marketing, even in channels that have not been associated with mass marketing in the past, like social media channels. And then lastly, next slide, yeah. The increased scrutiny of data practices will result in an increased importance of building out direct relationships between brands and consumers, so first-party data, greater expectations around consent, transparency, and control, increased commitment and investment in data governance, including limiting data access, sharing storage, and things of that sort, increased use in different types of metadata that will need to travel travel across the ecosystem, like labels concerning permitted uses and provenance, increased coordination across multiple departments like IT departments, data analytics, marketing, finance, to develop, approve, and implement these new solutions and operate within this new governance environment. And greater need for people with relevant skill sets and capabilities and processes for managing all of this complexity. So those are the three frameworks. That's where we think we are as an industry, and these are some of the implications of rising privacy regimes that are sort of the starting point for the Delphi study and for the conversation that we have with us today. Next slide, please. So the oracles of Delphi, the participating experts that we recruited for the document that will be released soon by the ARF, include Dennis Buckheim from Meta, Lukasz Chinajnik, General Counsel and Chief Privacy Officer at Nielsen, who was in last week's studio, Avi Goldfarb from University of Toronto, Tesseri Lin from the Questrom School at Boston University, who also was in last week's studio number 1, and Mark Vermouth from Neustar, who is on today's panel. And pardon Mark for the not updated title on that. We'll have that corrected in a moment. Next slide. And that leads me to the introduction. And here we have Mark's title correct. Vice President of the Knowledge Lab at Neustar, and Amy Young, currently at Sallie Mae, but previously in various positions in the advertising ecosystem, most recently prior to Sallie Mae at Lotame, and a good friend of the ARF. Both Mark and Amy have remarkable experience in the details of measurement and of managing the legal regimen around that. And so I welcome them to the stage.
Well, I have experience in the measurement. I've been exposed to the legal. I will not claim expertise. That's all Amy all the time.
That's kind of you. I couldn't remove it from my title, even if I wanted to these days, which sometimes I do, but I appreciate that.
So I gave a cursory introduction, just noting your title, but why don't you each take a moment to tell the audience a little bit about yourself and how you come to this subject. So
Amy, you can go first.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, hello, everybody. Thanks so much for taking the time for this very important topic today. My name is Amy Young, as Scott identified, currently Deputy General Counsel at Sallie Mae, and in past lives have participated in and helped lead companies through both their privacy journey and their technology footprint as a chief privacy officer and other legal leadership roles there. This includes the industries such as audience measurement with ComScore, with data disruptors and data aggregators, including on social media side like DataMiner, and with publishers and media as well. And then most recently in the ad tech industry at Lotame at DMP. Nice to meet you, Mark.
Awesome. So hi, first of all, really appreciate that we're gonna have the conversation today, and appreciate that the ARF, Scott, that you're driving an agenda to focus on the impact of privacy from a practical aspect of how do brands remain effective marketers, and how does it impact the ecosystem that we live in, and people are finally adopting the mad tech name because it sometimes feels mad. So I'm Mark Vermouth. I have been in marketing measurement for a while now, over a number of different companies that are now Neustar TransUnion company. This is my third career. I started my career in finance, actually, in valuation, which is what led me to marketing measurement, because it's such an important topic to make those, to tie the investments that you're making against how it's informing the growth of a business. At Neustar, I lead a team now that's responsible for thinking about ways to extend and advance how we can use the data, the technology, and the analytics we have to answer harder or more strategic questions for brands, and also building out our approach to data strategy, right? It's very entwined, right? In today's world, people need to focus on like, what data do we have? What can we do with it? What should we do with it? Which is a lot of what you want to talk about today. So I'm informed. We'll find out if I'm expert, but I have no problem talking about the topic.
Okay. In my experience, you rarely have difficulty talking about almost anything else.
Unfortunately true, sometimes good.
No, it's great. It's great. So let's start with kind of a high level paradox that, privacy has gotten very messy. We've got like a patchwork, a very fragmented landscape of regulations, and different policies on different platforms, inconsistent enforcement, ambiguity about where it's going in the future, very hard to see what might happen. I think we've got like 5 states with pending legislation, nothing at the federal level. If you're doing global marketing, it's even crazier. And fines and liabilities for mismanaging data. At the same time, more and more companies are sort of doubling down on their first party data, or even more interestingly, they're getting into the business of selling their first party data as an advertising asset. So, the cardinal example is, of course, retailers and the whole growth in retail media. But in the last couple of weeks, we've had announcements of new market entrants like Marriott, Lyft, Lowe's, Uber, and Apple. And so is there a contradiction between this sort of messy headache and all these companies trying to cash in on it? So what do you make of that?
So I'm not going to touch the question of all the regulations and where's it going and how do you manage the fact that there are multiple state approaches, although the IAB is focused on that from the multi-state privacy agreement perspective. There's a lot of work in Amy's world that's technical and challenging and has a lot of overhead. I will say what I generally see in terms of how companies are approaching this is lowest common denominator, right? Mm-hmm. So what is the threshold of approach to managing and thinking about data, especially customer data, that clears the hurdles for sort of the most stringent, depending on the geographies that you're working in, which is why the US tends to be managed and operated differently than, especially the EU, although as privacy regulations change, probably they'll get closer over time. And B, I think there's a real approach on the side of brands for being effective, reliable, and trusted stewards of the data that they have, absent from the regulatory and technological challenge they're facing in managing their stacks and the way that they approach to marketing. So starting from there, I think it might have been an impetus. It might have driven marketers to move faster to that perspective. And I think consumers are more knowledgeable about it because it's covered more in the media and that there's more traction and understanding around that. And, players like Apple and Google changing their and advertising that they're making these changes makes it something that people are more aware of. So that's the first half of it. The second half of it is the perspective that no marketer, no publisher, no ad tech platform has ever known everything there is possibly to know about a consumer anyway. And we had talked about this during the Delphi conversation. It is inaccurate to believe that anyone has ever had a magical single customer 360 understanding. Forrester just did a blog post on this the other day of everyone that they might touch or have touched in the world. But brands do know that their marketing and their relationships and their financial growth is more effective the more they know about their consumers. So there's always been participation in the marketplace by different vendors and providers of data and marketers to bring that together in an effective way. So to your question of, well, there are all these privacy limitations, but all these brands are looking at their first party data and they want to find value in there. There's no contradiction to that, right? Because there's a refocus internally on what do I have? Then there's an acknowledgement that no one has the full view and that participation and partnership will hopefully yield better financial returns and better customer experience. And I'm not going to talk about the definitions of selling and data provider and data access that are under the regulations, because you use the term sale of data. I don't want to get near that, but let's call it the use and application of data. And that's why you get clean rooms. And that's why you get an understanding of finding the technology that lets brands leverage the first party data that they have on behalf of themselves to maximize their value in a way that adheres to both what customers expect and are willing to experience and what privacy and regulations match. I don't see it as a contradiction. I see it as the market coming together on like 3 or 4 different legs that still center on the same aspect of, we have this data, we need to use it responsibly, but if we use it responsibly, consumers will have better experiences and we'll have more growth.
What do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely with Mark, your observations. I'll dive in on pockets that that you didn't hit, because I think largely we probably agree on all of this. I might characterize it a little differently. I might say that we're kind of further along on the bell curve. So agree, I don't think these are inconsistent. A decade or 15 years ago, a lot of companies were just thinking about, oh, let's do data collection. What can we do? This is going to impact our brand, but how and in what way? 15 years ago wasn't quite as acute as where we are today, and probably isn't going to be as acute as we will be 10, 15 years from now, right? So there's been a level of evolution. Just to acknowledge this point, which was also raised in the first panel, the notion of lowest common denominator and the iteration, both from the compliance and legal requirements, as well as, frankly, business pressure to make this a financially viable opportunity for the company, has just created a lot of churn and rework of the systems. And frankly, in my opinion, I think that has not only placed greater emphasis on the need for the first party data collection, but for companies with an existing first party footprint to then say, hey, we can actually really maximize this as a return on investment. And when you think about the increase in costs for compliance and then the need to recoup that, it almost just guarantees the outcome today, which is more pressure on making this financially viable, whether or not, whichever part of the ecosystem that you are a part of. And then this goes to, Mark, your last point in terms of branding and customer experience. And frankly, because again, this was talked about in our first episode, the notion that people and the way in which you ask the question and whether or not they like advertising is a little outcome determinative. I think we all intuitively, and then of course, as the data shows us, we are okay with experiences that are tailored to us, so long as the experience that's tailored to us makes sense and it's a self-ascribed extension of who we are and or who we think or want us to be. And so when it comes to those branding value adds, the notion of an immersive experience or building that out so it makes more sense is how all of the data then continues to dive in and where the companies are wanting to spend both in buying as well as putting in good infrastructure, that type of data, those types of data points that get there, and where I will say for audience measurement and otherwise, just as Lucas in our last panel described what a panel is and how it does and how it can try to get to that 360 that Mark just described. The rest of the rest of everybody ends up taking the benefit of that in whole or in part by then being able to try and pick out some of those additional audience behaviors that then can enhance what they, the data that they already know. So all of this to say is, no, I don't see that there's a contradiction. There's certainly sometimes unforeseen, but perhaps inevitable pressure that has been building for companies to mature this area and this state. And I think that's just where we are in our curve.
Let me press on that a little bit, Amy. At least the point, and it was something that was discussed in the Delphi conversation and certainly last week, that even though measurement and good measurement is something that is widely held and esteemed by companies in this ecosystem, it isn't always necessarily an easy thing to convey to the consumer as a benefit for them. I mean, if they get a discount on something or they get some sort of special service, they get their mapping software to work, there are all kinds of very tangible consumer benefits, but media measurement or advertising effectiveness measurement, not so much. So if you're one of those companies that is needing to get consent to measurement, if you're an ISP or you're an OEM, say you're, Samsung selling smart TVs and wanting to get permission. And I'm not talking about sort of opaque terms and conditions that nobody reads, but if you actually really wanted to get consent, you're a cable operator wanting to, monitor what's going on the set-top box for, any measurement use case you can think of. How do you actually close the sale with consumers here? What is that real benefit that we can articulate to them about measurement?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I know I bet I know that Mark has some additional thoughts on this, so I could see us spending a little bit more time on this in detail. I mean, there are probably two parts in which I would sort of initially respond to you, which is to say, it's sort of like the good bones of, it's the bones of a good house, which is there's infrastructure, and at a minimum, it's one of the opportunities where our industry, I think, collectively can really help enhance and identify this value to consumers. It comes off as different phrases, accuracy, whether or not the data is good, how we even in our industry end up describing it, I think comes off in several different ways, which then probably just makes it more difficult for a consumer to even understand the true value of this. And it's also one of those things where, just like a house, you can go into, hundreds of houses and don't necessarily know whether or not a house has good bones or not. But where when the plumbing stops working, or there's an outcome that consumers are highly aware of when it comes to poor audience measurement or poor data that then leads to a very, very inconsistent result. And so, that I think is the first type of observation that I would identify for you, which is I do think that as brands go, it is hard to identify. You can try to delineate, you can do it in any number of ways, including those very long privacy notices that we all tend not to read. But I also think a discerning view on that, and or the industry sort of taking it upon itself to then lift this point out is a really valuable one. And then the second way that I would sort of identify or address your question really relates to the brands themselves. A lot of our ecosystem tends not to focus on data accuracy, in part because sometimes it's not always clear how data is, quote, good or good for your business. And there's so many different ways in which it is evaluated that at the end of the day, some of this ends up being an outcome determinative exercise, i.e., if this data happens to be good and it is giving you a lift that you are happy with, then you'll go with that, regardless of whether or not you might have had some philosophical disagreement about whether or not the pool is great enough, whether, and the like. And so that's one of the areas in which companies that I've worked with have struggled, and frankly, data ethics is still an area that will continue to evolve. And whether or not there is some certain consistency on that, there are groups, as Mark identified, that I've been involved in and continue to be involved in, where we're at least trying to set up some definitional minimums, like how sufficient is the pool that it needs to be in order to then be able to accurately and or adequately, from a scientific perspective, give you a pool from which an appropriate measurement can be found. At what point in time is the number simply too small where you are able to find an individual for which we would argue that any brand would not need such micro level detail to then be able to get earn some value out of. And so I think that's the second consideration that I would raise. Mark, I know you've got a lot of thoughts on this too.
Well, I really like how you set it up, and I'm gonna say one thing on the second, then I'm gonna go back to the first, because I think the metaphor of a house is really helpful, and I'm gonna tell you what I heard. On the second part, the thing that I've been saying for years, and finally it's caught up. Sometimes you've experienced this, Scott. I get stuck on a point, and I'm like, you don't see it. And for years I was like, there's no such thing as one-to-one personalization. It's too hard. It's too costly. You can't do it. But everyone was telling it. I was like, it's audience level, right? People are different and unique, but within parameters, they're similar. And all that's happening is we're moving to an audience level perspective of measurement and activation and experience, which is manageable and engageable. And then that can work on the data side. And we can talk about cohorts and, privacy enhancing technologies, which is simply a fancy name for applying math and data science to information to obscure things. So that goes to the first part, right? The first part is we tend to use a lot of words that are not readily understandable by the marketplace, by consumers, right? And so let's go back to the metaphor of the house. So as I'm listening to you talk about, it's trust and value. Like, why do I choose a house? I trust that it's been built to at least some minimum specs that have been sent out, because there are local regulations and there are inspectors. And so I can trust to a certain degree that what I'm going to get is going to meet minimum thresholds of my expectations. And then there's value of which specific house I go to is based on who's building it and what am I going to get out of it. And I think the same thing. So the question started like, how do we communicate to consumers the use cases around in individual level data for measurement? And I think you need to take it up a level, which is, if I trust how it's going to be used and where it's going to be stored to a degree, and I get value from whoever that counterparty is, where that information lives, I'm actually not going to think about it, not all that much as a consumer. Now, I'm not saying creating trust and creating value is an easy thing to do, but it's too much to process, right? So how are there ways in which we can create trust? Well, I think trust is educating consumers about the ways in which their data is protected and use is restricted in plain English ways. I also think, so I had a conversation, we have an annual conference just on marketing technology in general, Brave New Worlds. We just had it earlier this month. And I had a conversation with Ajay Kapoor, who runs the performance marketing team, but owns measurement and audience and automation for GM. And in prepping for that, I actually, because we were talking about this issue, I went on the site to look at their privacy policy. And GM uses plain English to explain exactly the use cases around how people's data is going to be used. And this is a company, because if you think about the evolution of our world, there are sensors everywhere. We're collecting data because everything's a service. Everything is connected to the net because it enhances our existence to a certain degree. It makes our lives easier or better, or people wouldn't buy or opt into it. And they use very plain English. These are how we're going to use it. This is the type of information we may share with partners. This is how it might be used, right? And to a certain extent, if you go into a doctor's office, they also have plain English around HIPAA compliance, around this is who would be able to use your data and what they might see and when they might see it, right? When I just signed up for life insurance, I had to give permission for the life insurance company to access my medical data, but it was very clear why. I'm going to get life insurance out of it. I trust the company that I'm going to be buying it from, so I'm okay with the use of the data. I didn't know if it needed to be used for measurement or what algorithms it's going to go into or how they're underwriting me. I just needed to understand that. So I think if there's trust, clarity around what is being collected and how it's being used, and you get value from the organization that you're giving your data to, I think the hurdle is lower. I think the hurdle becomes higher with those companies, however they're playing in the ecosystem, where they can't clearly articulate the benefit that they're driving ultimately for consumers. And so I really like that analogy because it's trust and value. Both of those have to be in play for everyone in the ecosystem. And as a brand or a vendor or a platform or a publisher, I'm only going to want to partner with those people who live by trust and who deliver value. And so the winners and the losers, those will be the winners. And the losers, those who are more challenged, who will have less granular insight, will be those who don't live by those aspects. And I don't think that's such a bad thing.
Mark, I'll pick up on something that you just identified, which is probably as we continue to evolve, one of the areas, especially in legal and compliance, that I hope continues to evolve in this area is how the laws then prioritize, right? I mean, you mentioned HIPAA, for example, and HIPAA compliance. Well, the plain English that exists in all of the disclosures that we read have admittedly been around for a while. And so the language that we see and that we all sort of understand as plain English is because it's been sort of tried and true, and also where the regulators have then sort of emphasized, well, certain things mean more than others. And so, as we are probably still 2 steps away from that, with, as Scott, you identify, we still have at best, a handful of states that have passed in the United States, more that are still on. And then we've got, for most of us in global organizations, this global footprint, which then includes a lot of other laws. And even still, when you take a look at, say, comprehensive ones like GDPR, they're still identifying a collection of observations about the way in which one ought to treat privacy as applied to, say, the GM's footprint. And yet there isn't quite a level of hierarchy that is involved in which characteristic ought to be more important than the others. And in the meantime, we're all just, all of our companies are just trying to hit those themselves. And so, I am hopeful that over time, our laws and the way in which they're interpreted then start to improve and clarify for us what then makes a meaningful plain English disclosure, because things like we prioritize data minimization, which means there's just less data around to begin with. To me, I think that has a significant downstream impact. But today, the regulators haven't given anybody enough emphasis to then go out on the limb to say, we really are prioritizing data minimization, and therefore less data to then be incorrect or to then have to be rectified or to cause opacity. So those are some of the areas that I normatively would like and anticipate will happen.
This was a very interesting area of discussion within the Delphi about, and I think it was Lukács who put forward the notion of definition creep, that you used to have, sort of a pretty clear definition of PII, Usually, it's like your name and address, certain other things that are really attached to an individual. But of course, as regulation has kind of followed the lead of GDPR, the definition extends a lot to any device that you've got or any browser. And now, with cookie deprecation, there's an effort to kind of reconstruct identifiers to be able to move across all of these different spaces and link together with permanent or other solutions that are more transient. So I'm curious to know which of these you think might actually pass muster and survive this regulatory shift. It may be impossible to guess, but I mean, we've got some pretty big investments in unified ID. We've got companies that are, selling fingerprinting technology, device fingerprinting, matching on hashed email addresses. Some of these fall into, a gray zone of maybe they're compliant, maybe they're not. We don't know. It's part of this uncertainty. So do you have any thoughts on the implications of definition creep?
I think I heard you ask, are you willing to put your head in the open lion's mouth? I mean, I'll say this. For those who know me, I have been heavily involved and invested pre-GDPR, even as early as pre-GDPR in creating some unified opportunity for a daisy chain, one that was then adopted by the IAB-EU, and of course is under fire at the moment for not being sufficient and or as the Belgian DPA would identify in violation of GDPR. And I would say this, there is a disparity today, as there would be in any industry facing significant regulatory framework shifting, between the technologies that exist across all companies and the way in which we combine and associate and reassociate data with the laws themselves. And that clarity needs to be rehashed and clarified for companies to then have a more consistent approach, which goes to, I think, the definition creep characteristic that you identify, because we are now seeing a rash of regulations across the globe that are now coming up for any number of different reasons, and where, as a consequence to that, businesses are hampered in trying to even identify what the lowest common denominator is, and then spend resources in trying to rebuild to the extent that they didn't otherwise implement privacy by design. And so as an industry, we too are just going to be iterating ourselves in a way that then creates and continues to build on what I hope are successful supply chain solutions, ones that at least then carry through consent, that then further delineate the ways in which one can consent, which I think goes back to the bones of a house, which is to say, like, this is all infrastructure that today there isn't a consistency there. You don't actually know whether or not your house is hitting certain standards, because the standards are just like everywhere, but where there's just going to be iteration. And IAB-EU TCF, when we conceived of it, was never intended to be the end all be all. It has always been, just as the UUID conversations that I've been in, so and the other methodologies and principles, that they have all generally been intended, or at least I think they've all been intended to be a point in time which will invariably become iterated upon and or improved as we sort of lift up the industry and we move closer to narrowing the delta between where technology is today and where the regulations are at that point in time.
Well, I'm going to take a different perspective of what you were just saying, because you dive much deeper into the world, but the last thing you said about technology and catching up, technology is going to keep changing. And so the things that can be used to hopefully consensually identify, right, in a permitted way, who consumers are across those different technological platforms, it's going to change over time. And so I'm going to take it from the perspective of the approach we've taken, right? So we started in an offline identity world, right? And Neustar was an aggregation of a bunch of different technology companies who brought together and operated in the offline and the online space. And so over the last couple of decades, we migrated from offline, authoritatively, persistently knowing who people are and where they are, to linking that across platforms, right? We were always built on privacy by design. We are members of every single industry organization that's focused on the ethical use of consumer data. And in fact, we even had started a ethical, effective, efficient use of data council for a little bit, but there are only so many councils you can have in the world. But that's always been our perspective when we've started. And as we've updated and upgraded our identity infrastructure, the metadata that's associated with it and the framework and the flexibility that it operates within, we tag every piece of information that comes in with its use. What is the permissed use of the data? What is the origin of the data? And so from an industry practitioner perspective, all of that's going to keep changing. And there are going to be new identifiers that are going to come down the pike and new technologies. But what you need to do is you need to build a flexible framework that can adjust for that, use data for its permitted use cases that consumers have consented for, right? So you may not see everybody, and it goes back to the measurement question. Are you seeing enough? Can you make educated analytical decisions based on what you can see? And are you using it responsibly? So our approach has always been the market, the industry, the regulators. It's going to keep moving over time. There's probably never going to be an end point. It's going to be an evolution because technology isn't going to stop. But have we built a framework to operate within that so that we're respectful and ethical and consider how we're working with data that's respective and adhering to that and supporting the brands and the marketers and the platforms that we work with? So that's the other aspect to it. Are the companies in the business operating in a way that will allow them to pivot and adjust as the world changes?
No, I mean, I've always advocated privacy by design as the opportunity that companies can proactively address things coming down the pipeline that they don't even know, whether or not it's technology or regulatory approach. And otherwise, just as you've identified, Mark, it's a flexible way in which a company can adjust and frankly ends up saving, as I think now companies are beginning to realize, a significant amount of bandwidth and cost and headache and frankly tears in many ways to then be able to still be able to be fresh and be in front as much as one can when this changes, which if there's anything that you know about technology, we all know and recognize and embrace the fact that things are always changing. And so it's perennial in that regard. And I've been joking to some certainly in the last year or so that like privacy by design is the first ESG, if you will. It is in a way the way in which a company can truly incorporate and integrate social governance, environmental. I mean, it is a technology framework and stack that absolutely designs, so long as you design it, a way in which you can fully value your consumers, you can fully value your outputs. You, by architecting, have full control over the governance of this data and provenance throughout and through in. And then, of course, having a social impact on that for not just your own company and company value, but also for those clients that you serve. And I think it's useful, I think, Mark, just as you specifically identify, for us to be thinking about this way, and where a number of companies still to date have not really thought about or fully value or embrace the notion of privacy by design, which also I think will invariably go to help things like definition creep, consistency within an industry in terms of what is and isn't consent, how we flow it down, the buckets in which we create.
Yeah, and the other one sec, I mean, the other half of this informs our ethos, because the other half of our business, is credit reporting data, is what TransUnion serves in the marketplace, and our focus as an organization is information for good, right?
Mhm.
So that that's the approach you need to take. You trust and value is as you laid out, I think, the foundation.
So I wanted to pick up on something that both of you touched on previously, but I think is an interesting subject in and of itself. So if we take as a given that there's a lot of difficulty that companies have to manage in this sort of evolving but uncertain privacy regulatory landscape, and along the way, signal loss and data deprecation, things like that. So and there's already been a fair amount of research on sort of unintended consequences of, say, GDPR. Well-intended regulatory change that happened to actually favor industry consolidation and make the big bigger and push everybody toward multiple walled gardens. Completely an unintended consequence, but something that most scholars that have looked at it would agree has happened. So thinking, sort of taking a step back a little bit and thinking about what lies ahead, who do you see as being the beneficiary? Who wins and who loses among different kinds of companies? And then think about it also from the standpoint of different kinds of methods for research and analytics. Who would you expect to be rising or falling as a result of our current situation?
Well, I would
Well, I'm
say,
happy to
okay.
go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I'm not gonna, neither of us are naming names, but I'll give you a categorical framework that you think about it. Any company that lives on network effects or has a clear improved product or service for a consumer based on the data that it's exposed. And both Tesserae did a really nice job last week of showcasing those types of things. Those are the companies that will have permission because they're delivering value to consumers for getting identity-based data or individual level data. And it's not necessarily the size of the company, because you could be a small company and deliver on that. And there's national versus global versus local. You could be big in your local area and that can be enough. I think we get lost in the fact that we tend to service or work for really large companies. And so we think of that scale, but small and medium-sized businesses are the economic driver, at least in the US. And so you don't have to be gigantic, but you either have to have a network effect in your locus of operation, or you need to demonstrate value in return to consumers for the product and service you deliver, for their data being an input to that. And so those are the types of operators who will continue to have a clear and bigger view of consumers directly, but also used ethically, used appropriately and according to regulations and in ways consumers respond to. That data can be made available in partnerships to other brands. So that's kind of the framework that I would think of about how you view it.
Amy?
Mark, we're on the same thread here. So if there's something that I would add, I mean, fundamentally it's, there's a reason why the big just got bigger. And part of it is because just as Mark sort of identified in the framework description, being able to then be first party and or having that value add, which then puts you in the position of first party, is certainly where many companies and individuals far smarter than me have then oriented themselves as the way of the solution. And so, and we even see this now in, for example, the ESG outputs that companies who are now required to report, putting aside technology, are doing. Those who say own the buildings that they have, or they own the airwaves that for which their planes fly, are able to better enumerate and identify what their environmental impact is because they have control over it. And so that I'm sure will be and continues to be a trend, putting up or juxtaposing that with antitrust and some of those considerations for which laws like DMA are going to be sort of intersecting. I think many more people are familiar and or realize that intersection in regulatory landscape now than than people may have realized a few years ago, but that the notion of the technology and data is the new oil comes with it all of the similar antitrust and other considerations as well. So just putting that one out there as well.
So I would flip to the other side of the question, which is inherent in that, is what does that do to measurement and how brands make decisions and evaluate the effectiveness of their marketing in light of unevenness of first party or user level data? And that's being tackled on two fronts, right? One front is the idea of clean rooms and privacy enhancing technologies that enable multiple parties to get access in a secure, non-identifiable, non-user level way to analyze and integrate those data sets in order to do the measurement, whether it's simply reach and frequency and overlap, or it's true incremental measurement. And it's still early days for that, but it's been proven out in use cases as we move over time. And so that's part of it. But the second part of it is we always live in the now. So we assume how now is how it's always been. I have a 6-year-old son, so I experience that every day, the incapacity to understand that today is not how it's always been. And the idea of like user level, offline, online, full journey analytics and incrementality is actually fairly new. You couldn't really do it a decade ago, right? We at best 15 years ago, your attribution at a user level was based on web logs and clicks, which we all know is not actual incremental measurement because of all of the biases that are built into the methodology. So the first thing is what we're doing now is actually new. So what did people do before then? They did experimentation, they did surveys, they did focus groups, they had segmentation, and they did MMM. None of that goes away. In fact, MMM has advanced over the last 5 to 10 years because of attribution, pressuring it to be more effective, especially in industries where there isn't first-party data today anyway, to go more granular, to figure out how to leverage new methodologies and techniques to get more insights out of MMM, right? And then the second aspect of it is this data isn't going away, it just may be smaller, right? By the way, it was always small. It was never consensus. It was never the full universe. You always had to look at the bias of what was inside of that data and bench it against sources of truth to evaluate how to adjust for that. So that's, again, not a new problem, something the industry has been tackling for a while. So we're just going to go from giant data sets that were biased and you had to understand them to smaller big data sets that still let you draw conclusions from the data where you're being permitted to see it in areas where it's protected. And you can talk about privacy enhancing technologies like multi-party compute, where you're breaking stuff apart. So, for secret computation, so no one has any information that they could reassemble, but you could analyze against it. Distributed compute, where you're computing within and you're bringing the values of the features back into a single model. That's the way we're going to move. But I think it's a hard problem, but I see the industry tackling it. And again, it's about education to brands. And it goes back to something Amy said earlier about accuracy and understanding the methodology. And are we actually making better decisions against what we're doing? So I just think we're going to evolve again, but we've been evolving for the last 30 years. And we have really smart statisticians and econometricians and data scientists who are tackling it. We just have to evolve a little bit more. And I think it'll be all of those. We're going to do MMM. We're going to do experimentation. We're going to do attribution across multiple channels. And we're going to use panels. And we're going to look at segmentation. And you're just going to have to triangulate to make the best decision that you can.
And for any who might have seen the rather impassioned speech at a different ARF event yesterday, beamed in from London from the IPA, Les Binet gave a very full-throated argument that actually, econometrics is strategically much more helpful to companies because you should be optimizing on profitability rather than return on investment anyway. And, you know, it's a whole very interesting argument around
It's
that.
not 1P. I was glad to
I
hear
know.
someone
But
else
he
say that
also
on
said, you know,
stage.
there's a lot of, there's an awful lot of opportunities around pricing and the other
Mhm.
piece. Anyway, but we are at time, so I'm going to take this moment to thank the both of you for a spirited conversation, and also to thank our audience, to thank Meta for sponsoring this pair of studios, and to also remind everyone to keep an eye out for not only the link to this session, which you can then share with any of your colleagues when the recording is compiled, but also to the forthcoming Delphi report on this extended conversation on changing privacy frameworks. And with that, I wish you all a very good afternoon.
Thanks a lot for the opportunity, and Amy for the conversation.
It was great.
Thank you both.
Thanks. Bye-bye.